So, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Liked it so much, let's do it again. Let's try another video lecture. This one, Age of Imperialism, focus on Asia, with maybe a little tiny bit about the United States as an imperialist power. Kind of an unusual situation there, so I think worth mentioning in, after all, what is a world history course. You'll notice in the background a little bit of music. This is Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. I'm not sure if that'll be distracting or provide a delightful little backdrop to kind of keep your energy up. Let me know what you think afterwards. So we've already in this class discussed the basic origins of imperialism, and we've looked a little bit of African imperialism. You're going to notice something looking at that would suggest that Africa's a little bit different. Hey, good time to remind you of what you're doing for this assignment. I want you to come to class with 3 typed questions for the class. These can be factually based. These can be open-ended discussion-based questions. Minimum of 3. Hey, you can come with more. Not a bad thing. Also, there will be times where I will ask you to pause the video and say, wait, why do you think that? Or what do you predict? Or what are you seeing here? Obviously, I can't enforce that, but I think it will help you an awful lot if you are to think about what you're hearing and seeing rather than just doing it. I'm going to try that out right now. Compared to the map of Africa that you have seen so many times during the 1880s, 1890s, what looks different? What things look different in the map of Asia? Pause the film for a second. So you're probably noticing, first of all, that unlike Africa, which with the exceptions of Liberia and Ethiopia have been formally colonized by Europeans, hey, much of this land here has not been. China, as you can see, is the Republic of China. However, I think you know that China is in fact not really an independent country in many ways. I see the same with Siam, Thailand, parts of the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Persia, only under the influence of other areas. Also, you might notice that there are a couple of new imperial powers. There are no Japanese or American forces anywhere within Africa. You are seeing Japan taking over Korea, parts of China, Formosa, which is today Taiwan, correct? And the United States that occupies the Philippines in 1899. The major players in Asia we're looking at, primarily England, to a degree France, and the Netherlands. England is the big player, but we'll briefly mention Russia very briefly, Japan, and the United States toward the end. Notice that only about is formally under imperial control. These countries you're seeing here control about half of the Asian landmass. However, the influence extends greatly beyond that. England is the key one. India and Burma, historically very, very different societies. Burma, of course, is called Myanmar today, but England not only colonizes both, but brings them together in one unit at one point. The Malay states, well, that's Malaysia. Yep. Major influence in the Middle East, Southwest Asia, as it's also known. Afghanistan, as we've mentioned, in China. So it's not simply that which is part of the British Empire, but where British has real military, political, economic, cultural, social influence. Early days in England, this should be new for you. A privately held company, these are private investors created, you're probably well aware that there was a French East India, French West India, Dutch East India, Dutch West India, British West India Company. Bottom line, these are private investors that want to make a lot of money through trading. Why get investors? Well, actually stop that for a second. Stop this film for a second and ask yourself, what's the advantage of a corporation like this as opposed to just going out and exploring yourself? Really, it's about risk and resources. I may not have $50 million to hire a fleet of ships. If I do have $50 million, man, to see those ships go down and I'm bankrupt forever. Here, you're finding other people willing to invest, number one, so you can get the resources. Secondly, if a ship sinks or a shipment of stuff, of spices or whatever else is lost, it's not only me that pays the price for it. It is not a British government organization, but the British government recognizes pretty early on that it's in their interests, in their country's interests, that these trading companies are effective. So strong government support, sometimes militarily. The Mughal Empire, which hit its peak probably under Akbar, maybe Aurangzeb, so we're talking in the, 1550s to maybe about 1700, begins to weaken somewhat, and little by little, the British East India Company, the BEIC, becomes the dominant force in Asia. In India, in 1757, a major battle in which not England, not Great Britain, but the armies of the British East India Company effectively defeat the Mughal emperor. And although technically there is a Mughal emperor sitting on the throne, really the power, the big decisions are made by the British. This changes in 1857. Hey, what's in a name? Well, I can tell you that if I were to come in next week and say, my new name is Sargon of Akkad, you would all treat me with such great respect and reverence. There's a reason why, yes sir, no sir. That sets kind of a precedent for how that person is treated. If I were to come in next week and announce that my new name is Mr. Stupid Stinky Pants, my guess is you would all come to treat me with even less respect than you already do. What something is named matters, and there was an event in 1857 that some refer to as the Sepoy Rebellion. Some call it the First War of Independence. Some call it the Great Rebellion. This makes a difference. Sepoy sepia, a brown color, i.e., these were the Indian soldiers that fought on the behalf of the British. Now, what exactly is a rebellion? Well, it's people rising up against legitimate powers. And it sounds as if some individual soldiers rebelled, rose up. You'll then see the First War of Independence. What seems to carry more weight? What seems more important? A rebellion of a few people or a First War of Independence? Maybe splitting the difference. It's a rebellion, but it's the Great Rebellion. British sources, Indian sources, modern sources, older sources will use different terms, and they probably do matter. You might have heard of this. What were the causes? Fat. Animal fat. Well, the problem was that in order to store the types of bullets that were needed for the types of muskets used then, they had to be stored in something wet, something that would keep the moisture in them or they'd dry out. And the natural choice was animal fat. You would take the fat, you'd put the bullets in it, and the process would be that when loading a new bullet cartridge into the rifle, the soldier would reach in, grab it, bite off the end of it, and insert it into the gun. Problem: these soldiers were generally Hindu and Muslim. Rumors went around, true, untrue, maybe not that important, that the fat that was being used was pig fat. Do you see a problem for the Muslim soldiers? Others said, no, I hear it's beef fat. It comes from cows. Problem with the Hindu soldiers. This leads into a massive rebellion with people slaughtering people on both sides. You'll notice I say ongoing unhappiness. My guess is that if everything was hunky-dory within Britain's empire in India, that something like this wouldn't turn into a massive rebellion. Now, it does not spread to the whole country. This is not a full-on, if you want to say strictly speaking, is it a war for the independence of India? I think that's overstating parts of the country. It gets very, very bloody. And ultimately, the end of this, and naturally the British with their huge armed forces are able to put the rebellion down. But what ultimately happens with this is the British government decides that, this is too important. India is too important to Britain's economy, to our society, to our view of ourselves, to our empire. We simply can't leave this in the hands of a British East India Company, which was a great thing for Britain and a great thing for us 200 years ago. Perhaps it's time as the British government assumes direct control. It is the end of the East India Company, the Mughal Empire, and 20 years later, Queen Victoria names herself Empress of India. Now, as I've mentioned, what's in a name? I'm going to ask you to stop the film for a second and read through one view of this rebellion. And then to ask you to stop the film for a second and read this view. Questions to ask yourself. What's the most important story in the two? You might go back and forth. What matters the most? What's worth mentioning? The stories are essentially the same. There's not much disagreement about what happened in 1857. I think the question is, what happened afterwards? Why is it worth thinking about this today? So pause the film for a second and consider that. And I suspect that you get toward the notion that for the British version, well, what's important is there was a rebellion, and this is why it happened, and this is the result of the rebellion. The import, well, the British came in and assumed direct control. The Indian view, oh, all of that is true, but it's not what's important. That the British had essentially violated their right to rule over India, and although it would take almost another century, England's time in India was coming to an end because of what happened in 1857. Again, is one clearly right and the other clearly wrong? Probably not. This is history class, not math class, where 5 plus 5 equals 9. The British Raj. The Raj is the empire in India. You see these numbers. Kind of interesting that you can have about 100,000 British people controlling 250 million Indians. Well, ask yourself why that might be. Now, probably the obvious answer and people want to look at is more weapons, more firepower, and that's definitely part of it, but it's also with the way the British administered India. I would put to you that if the British stormed in with 100,000 people and said, we will control all that you, the Indians, do, we will control your religion, we will administer everything, you will be subservient to us, that's really not going to work. And the British take the approach in India, as they do really throughout most of their colonial possessions, of training those people in India and then later in Africa who can do the work for themselves, setting up education, creating civil servants, very often with the local rulers. There are hundreds of local rulers throughout India. Rather than forcing them off their throne, you know what, guys? Stay. You are the prince. You are the Nawab. You are the Raj of this area. Terrific. Do what we say. Make sure your people pay their taxes. Don't violate the laws we set down. But keep your power. Why not do it that way? And so the British are quite willing to work with local authorities in order to maintain their power. I think it's very worth mentioning how incredibly important this was to Great Britain. I mean, notice 20% of Britain's exports, and you think, well, exports, does that matter? Oh, it does, because what did Napoleon call the British? A nation of shopkeepers. That's what made England great. They were the first to industrialize. They needed huge markets, and 20% of what they sent went out to India. They got cotton and other materials, and also the Indians paid for their own upkeep, as it were, their own government. Hey, I want to go back for a second to the idea of the exports. Indians had plenty of cotton, the Brits had none. Well, the British certainly passed laws that stopped Indian textile production, wouldn't allow factories to open, insisted that the raw materials, the cotton, sent to England, to the factories of Manchester and Leeds, produced into clothing and raw materials, sent back to India and sold as a price. That's something that eventually comes to really anger the Indians. Emotionally, it was important. No upper middle class, wealthy, aristocratic, noble government leader in India, in England, ever went through their young years without spending some time in our India. Winston Churchill, after World War II, was vehemently opposed to Indian independence, and a lot of it was just emotion. This is part of England. You do start seeing nationalist movements. The Indian National Congress in 1885, a Muslim league, because you had about a 20% Muslim minority in India, begin to move not so much for independence. You don't even hear talks of that initially, but what you start seeing is moving for Indian autonomy, Indian rights. Initially, Muslims and Hindus are working pretty closely together. That starts to fall apart in the 1920s and 30s and beyond that. Just some cartoons here, and just take a moment. This is from a children's book. You all needed to learn your alphabet somewhere. Read these over, stop the film for a second, read these over, and tell me how this will affect the minds of kids reading it. I think there is a built-in sense that these are lesser creatures than the noble Englishmen. You just simply see the way that they look. The colonies are there for our joy, our entertainment, and by goodness that since we Englishmen would never lie or tell an untruth, certainly savages like this are probably well served to stay under our control. You can stop this for a moment just to have a look. Again, different place, different time. I don't have much more to say about this except that it's always cool to look at old pictures, isn't it? The French. I won't say anything about the British in Burma, although I know a fair amount about that from having lived there, or Malaysia. Quick look at the French. Certainly part of why they're going in. Now, you might recall from last semester that the French were a part of India. They were involved in India. It's really the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. The French are defeated. They are forced almost entirely out of the Indian subcontinent. Well, here's another territory in this general area. Now, you see up here is China to the north. Nobody is going to take over China in 1880. Actually, nobody is going to take over China, period. It's just too big, too well established. But if the French wish to have some place in here, they wish to have their sense of belonging, of having a position of power and authority and access to resources in Asia, well, it can't be India over here to the west. It can't be China to the north and the east. Perhaps this territory here. Indochina is today 4 separate countries. It's Vietnam, which you'll see here. It's Laos. It's Cambodia, and Thailand, which is often considered part of Indochina, remains independent. The British Empire, Burma and India, is to the west of Thailand. Certainly, if you look more into this, it's not that the Thais had complete independence and fought off European invaders, kind of an agreement to exist as a buffer state. Leave us alone, and we won't give you any kind of trouble at all. So this is the Asia that we are looking at by about the turn of the century. You can spend some time looking at this. We'll look to a similar map. Again, technically, this is independent China, but as we mentioned, it really isn't independent, or they don't make their own decisions, especially economically. The Japanese, of course, begin to expand as well. French have relatively little presence here, but they are there. And the British are the dominant European powers for sure. That's essentially the same map, isn't it? Good for me. That's, again, pretty much the same map. Okay. Looking quickly at the Dutch, and I'm going to spend a little more time in this than I probably need to, or may, at least actually I'll probably just put the slides up because they're cool to look at. As you know, I lived in Indonesia for a couple of years. The Dutch East India Company, also called the VOC, for those of you who speak Dutch in this room, probably nobody, maybe somebody. The Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, anyway, VOC means Dutch East India Company. Same thing, it has the power to wage war, it's an independent country, the Dutch government stands behind it, but it is technically separate from. From about 1800, the Netherlands government actually assumes control. That's a little bit for the British. The Dutch government sees it in their interest. Interesting, there is a brief period in which the French control Indonesia, as we know it today, because, of course, Napoleon conquers, takes over the Netherlands. There is no Netherlands to control. The British then come in with Napoleon's defeat in 1815, kick the French out, and then the question is does it belong to us, the British? Does it belong to the Dutch? In effect, there is a negotiation on this. The Dutch agree to not challenge the British in India, and the northern part of this area, which becomes the Malay states, or Malaysia, and the British return this area to the Dutch. Now, could the British potentially have maintained control? I'm about to walk over to you with my fist and hit you on the head. Bop! It's not in the British interest. That balance of power, don't make anybody too unhappy, no need to be greedy, we can all benefit, is sort of the idea. Keeping in mind that you're Indonesia today, which looks all nice and neat on a map, there's no history, even the central island of Java, numerous different kingdoms, etc. You don't need to know about these specific wars, but it should be pretty clear that this conquering, this colonizing does not go terribly smoothly with all these 30, 40-year wars throughout. The Dutch are kind of interesting in Indonesia. They begin, remember, why are these colonies here? About, well, we are civilizing these poor people. That's not really what's going on. Countries don't invest hundreds of millions or billions of modern-day dollars in the lives of their people to, quote, civilize others. It's, of course, about what makes money. Primary interests. Parts of Indonesia were called the Spice Islands. The whole key is things that can be grown or extracted from Indonesia that can be easily sent back to Europe to make money. They call these cash crops. These are crops that don't have inherent nutritional value for the people themselves, i.e. vegetables. Carrots are really good for you. You can't grow a lot of Indonesian carrots and send them on an oldie-timey ship back to Europe. It's not going to work that way. Well, the cultivation system of the 1830s, again, this is Dutch policy because it is now a Dutch government organization running Indonesia, said that 20% of all land had to be devoted to cash crops. Coffee, primarily, tea, rubber, tobacco, sugar. You see the list there. Estimates are, it's hard to do this, but the estimates are about 1 billion Dutch guilders. I can't tell you what a guilder is compared to a dollar, but it's certainly a huge amount of money is taken from modern-day Indonesia by 1870. It is thought that about a quarter of the Dutch budget, a quarter of the Dutch government spend and had access to every year came directly from Indonesia. Now what this means, particularly in the main island of Java, when people are plowing up their food fields and what they're instead replacing with coffee, tea, rubber, etc., massive famine. Java apparently did not have a history of food shortages. It has the reputation in Indonesia as being incredibly fertile land. It's the golden land of Indonesia. It's overpopulated today, but it absolutely had enough to feed its people, and it introduces famine. Now keep in mind where we are at 1901. You know, the years in 150 years into the Enlightenment, the idea of equal rights. People are turning against imperialism. People are starting to question within Europe, why is it that we Europeans can do that to them? You have the anti-slavery, the anti-abolition movement, which abolished slavery by the 1850s, 60s, pretty much worldwide. And there are a lot of forward thinkers in Europe saying, you know, economic slavery or exploitation or assigning a people to famine because we want more profit, that's not right either. What are we Europeans doing for those people there? And your friend, Edward D. Morel, who is writing about what's happening in the Congo, he's already written some of what he has out there. That type of thinking is moving its way through Europe. This leads to the so-called ethical policy. Ethical, meaning moral, doing the right thing. The idea is that the Dutch government became devoted to a degree toward doing good stuff for the Indonesians. Setting up schools, migrating, moving people from overcrowded to other places, irrigation, growing more food, relaxing a lot of the cultivation system. It can't just be about our profit. Interesting, sometimes the best of intentions cause you some trouble. It also jump-started a nationalist movement. You now had a small number of educated, capable Indonesians who could read, who could write, who understood the world outside of Indonesia, who had maybe read the U.S. Constitution, who had read of the French Revolution, the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas of, say, what was happening with Edward D. Morel. Oh, in particular, read about how the Japanese had gone from poor, impoverished, and subservient to defeating the mighty Russian bear, a European country. Suggests to a lot of Indonesians, those small numbers that can read and write, maybe we can do this too. Few photographs. Batavia is modern-day Jakarta. And you can slow down on these if you're interested. I just had them, and it's kind of cool to see how people used to live, yeah? You know what you're probably seeing here? Well, tell me about this. Think about this. Tell me of this family. Who are they? And I think you're probably getting the idea that they're fairly wealthy by Indonesian standards. You'll notice they're wearing neckties. They're pretty educated. These are probably the children at a Dutch-run Indonesian school. Now, I don't know who these 6, 7 individuals are, But is it possible that one or two of them emerged from their Dutch-provided education, which, of course, as much as providing for the poor Indonesians, is following the British model of creating loyal and educated civil servants who can help push the system forward? Do you think it's possible that one of these kids started to grow up and saw the inconsistency and saw the double standards and saw the racism and saw the poverty and read the works of Voltaire and John Locke and the American Revolution and started to think, we Indonesians can do better for ourselves? Very possibly, with some of these young faces, you have future independence leaders. Again, just to get the idea that Indonesia was not simply one big happy family that was taken over by the Dutch. It happens over the course of, well, a couple centuries, really. And it's actually not until the 20th century that everything we consider to be modern-day Indonesia is largely, mostly under one country's control, or unified under one government. Again, just a cool photograph. Looks like Balinese dance to me. Hey, there are a couple of voices coming out of it. One of them is Dutch. Multatuli was his name. Actually, he was a Dutch writer, Edward Dekker. Wrote a book called Max Havelaar in 1860. Now, this is a novel. This is a story, but it chronicles the absolutely awful conditions on the plantations, the coffee plantations in particular. People worked to death, peasants kicked off their land, famines, beatings, abuse, discrimination, etc. And keep in mind, 1860, now that's a few years after Uncle Tom's Cabin, the famous book that exposed the horrors of slavery in the United States. There is a small but growing percentage of Westerners out there that begin to believe in some sense of universal right and justice. Now, I know it's been 150 years since John Locke first kind of tossed the words out there, but realistically, during the Enlightenment, universal rights for all meant universal rights for all modern Europeans, and modern European men, really. You do start seeing around various parts of Europe a questioning of whether it's only about white folk, only about Europeans. And this book is fairly influential. Wow, that cultivation system that is assigning people such misery, that's not right. And I don't think it's a coincidence that a couple decades later, that so-called ethical system comes into power. Really interesting character, and I'll go very quickly with her. She's simply known as Kartini. She died at the age of 25, but she is a woman who grew up basically to be an Indonesian woman, which meant to be subservient to the man. She's told who she's married, and the husband has as many wives as he wants. She had written a whole series of letters where she argues for women's right, women's equality, for a certain modernization, and absolutely for a sense of Indonesian nationalism. You can read these quotes. There is actually every April, there is a Kartini Day. We didn't get the day off from school, but I had a couple of years I was in Indonesia. Certainly saw posters and flyers and events happening around town. And virtually every Indonesian student knows exactly who Kartini is. Worth stopping to take a look at these quotes just to get a sense of who she was. She died, by the way, during childbirth when she was 25, her first child, so there's a certain tragedy to that. This is a little out of our time frame, but it's kind of worth noting. I won't ask you to read or learn the Indonesian, but these are the people you see below, possibly one of those kids you saw before dressed up. They are educated by the Dutch, but rather than admiring and serving the Dutch, they see themselves as the leader of a new united Indonesia. Now, when there is a nationalist movement, and as you'll see, this happens across the colonized world after World War I, a legitimate question is, what are we? Are we East Javanese people, and they're the West Javanese people, and they're the Sumatran people, and they are the Papuan people, and they are the Moluccan people? Are we 4, 7, 8, 10, 100, 200, 400 different societies that will find our own way? Or are we better off served joining together as one Indonesia, one group, one set of people with different religions, languages, etc.? And if you'll take a look at this youth pledge that was taken by these young nationalists, first of all, we are sons and daughters of Indonesia, and we acknowledge one motherland, Indonesia. So we may or may not be Javanese or Moluccan or Sulawesian, but we sure are Indonesian. Secondly, we are the sons and daughters of Indonesia, and we acknowledge one nation, the nation of Indonesia. So it's not just that politically different nations will come together. No, this is our nationality as well. And thirdly, we, the sons and daughters of Indonesia, uphold the language of unity, Indonesian. Well, it seems kind of, the language, who cares about that? This is possibly what has kept Indonesia together. There were major debates around the time, well, what's the language of the Indonesian people? The common view was, look, most of us live in the island of Java. Javanese is the common language. Of course, that's what we're going to use. A couple of problems with Javanese: it is incredibly difficult to learn. It is a very complicated, with just bizarre grammar rules. And secondly, if the two-thirds majority of the people in what might become Indonesia have their own language as the dominant language, you can see the bad feelings that might come out in different parts of what is to be Indonesia. The decision was made. It was a very calculated decision. We need to create a language that all Indonesians can speak. And they took a basic Malay language, they stripped it of its grammar rules, and largely said, this is the language of all Indonesians, and if you get the grammar wrong, that's okay. And even my Indonesian teacher told me, you know what, the grammar doesn't really matter. Just make sure you say it and be clear. We're used to that. Which is handy for me because I am so brutal in other languages. Finally, you know what, store this name away. Pramodia Anantatur, one of my favorite authors, wrote 4 remarkable books about independence, turn of the 20th century, Indonesian lifestyle, and the nationalist movement. I don't expect you to run out and find them now, but keep the book there. I think he was flat out brilliant. Finally, taking a quick look at the United States, you'll notice that Asia, Africa, you're not really seeing the United States. Paying attention, you did notice the Philippines, but the United States is not a part of the world of battling over different parts of Asia and Africa, and we're going to explore quickly some of the reasons why. Quick stop here. Can you take a look at what's going on in this image? I think we all see it's the United States. We all see conveniently that Florida looks like a nose, and the Gulf of Mexico looks like a mouth, and there's a yummy little tidbit, a little fish there called Cuba, about to be swallowed up. I guess that's a mountain rain or something making the eye, God only knows. So the Spanish-American War. Now, the United States has really not been involved in foreign wars to this point. The United States is not involved in the Napoleonic Wars. In fact, the United States does go to war with Britain in 1812 because the British were insisting you Americans cannot trade with Napoleon and the French anymore, and kept intercepting American ships, which led to the United States and England in 1812 to 1814, a brief war between them. Mostly skirmishes more than anything else, but a real war. By the way, there's nearly war between the United States and France at the same point for the same reason. The United States largely stays out of foreign entanglements, however, makes an exception in 1898. Now, the nominal, the set excuse, the reason was, my God, the horrible Spanish government is abusing the poor people of Cuba. We cannot let that happen. Now, I think if you'll stop for a point and say the United States built on slavery, 30 years later slavery is abolished, but African Americans are probably more brutalized and victimized and impoverished in the United States by 1900, I don't really think the United States is going to go to war to protect the poor Cuban people. Obviously, it's the sugar, it's the shipping, it's other countries in the world are taking their colonies. Perhaps the United States need its area. So when the United States finally gives Spain a warning about Cuba, and after an American ship is not by the Spanish, but it did happen, the United States then begins its attack on the Philippines, which is kind of odd because we thought it was about Cuba. The United States then, and it's a quick Spanish surrender. Spain has been a dying power really for a couple hundred years. The United States is coming into its own as a massive, massive power. I think we're talking LeBron James and Steph Curry versus Kobe Bryant at this point might be what we're looking at if you want a basketball analogy. And then the United States moves into Cuba. Now this lasts a little bit longer, but this is still a 4-month-long war. U.S. Secretary of State John Hayes called it a splendid little war. Why splendid? Well, splendid because we won, and in the overall course of things, it didn't cost the United States a lot, and the United States as a whole got something out of it. Unknown to most Americans, and I think if you were to find 100 Americans randomly on the street and say, tell me about the Philippine-American War, I think that would be, oh, did the United States just go to war with the Philippines? No, no, no. This happened over 100 years ago in 1898. It is normally lumped in with the so-called Spanish-American War, 1898 to 1902. But as I mentioned, the Spanish-American War begins in August of 98. It lasts about 3 months, and it's over, and the Spanish are not involved. Fighting continues in the Philippines. And here's why. Well, the U.S. had promised independence to the Philippines before the war. Emilio Aguinaldo, who you'll see here, who's seen as kind of the father of the Philippines, he would be the Lumumba of the Congo or the Nehru of India or something like that, Gandhi of India, either one. Filipinos, when the Spanish surrendered, set up their government. The United States, about 2 months later, sent in soldiers to, well, take over the Philippines. There is a 4-year war that possibly kills about 250,000 people, mostly Filipino. Some have argued 4, 5, 6, 700,000. Again, people will either inflate or deflate numbers depending upon their intentions. It is absolutely a war on civilians, and if we had a little more time, we'd spend looking at this and making some parallels to other places and other times. The United States keeps the Philippines in 1946. Again, look at what's being said in 1897 when the whole question of the Philippines comes up. I cannot speak of forcible annexation, for that cannot be thought of. That, by our code or morality, would be criminal aggression, said U.S. President McKinley in 1897. Admiral Dewey, who led the attack upon the Philippines, upon the Spanish in the Philippines, our American Constitution does not permit us to expand territorially outside of America. The Filipinos can be assured of their independence. And Admiral Dewey, later, after the war, I never treated Aguinaldo as an ally, except to assist me in my operations against the Spaniards. Seems like a conflicting message. In March of 1899, again, the Spanish-American War is over since December. The Americans come back in with a heavy naval fleet, and they make the statement to the Filipino people, the supremacy of the United States must and will be enforced throughout every part of the Philippines, and those who resist it can accomplish no other end other than their own ruin. So it seems fairly clear that independence for the Philippines was not a major part of the agenda. Americans do have an empire at this point. There's an island called Guam, way out in the middle of the Pacific, and the Philippines. In terms of forcibly annexing, and Hawaii in 1898, I believe, becomes formally part of the limited imperial domain that it has. And you might stop for a moment and ask yourselves, why does the United States not go into Asia to a large degree, and basically not at all into Africa? What stopped the United States from doing that? Pause the film and come up with a nice answer. Well, certainly if you think about the size of the United States, you think about all the resources within it, all the open land, probably wasn't so necessary, and that's a huge part of it. There may have been some moral obligations, but I think once you look at the realities of the Philippines and, say, the Mexicans during the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, I kind of downplay that. I think essentially not really that necessary, though if we Americans were to control the Philippines, boy, that's really convenient if trade really opens up with China and Japan and the like. So there are purposes behind it, but probably not that necessary. Hopping back in history a little bit, we're looking here at the United States with Latin America. James Monroe was a president. United States 1817 to 1825 sounds right to me. A doctrine is simply a statement on behalf of the United States. All it says is the United States will not allow European countries to come into North, South America, or the Caribbean. Now, the Spanish were in Cuba at this point. Sure, that's fine. But notice 1823, that is a couple of years after almost all of Central America and South America had declared and gained its independence from Spain. So the United States is seeing a power vacuum. These are new, weak, independent states. And the concern was that the French, that the English, that the Dutch, that the Russians might say, aha, weak, new, start-up republics in South America, let's go get some for us. This is the United States saying, absolutely not. If you outside countries come into the Americas, it means war with the United States. The United States won't let this happen. The United States also vowed that at the same time we stay out of European affairs. Prussia goes to war with Russia or England or France, that's your business. This gets updated. You might know from your math class. What is a corollary, say, in geometry? It's an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. By the way, this confuses a lot of people. Roosevelt is not Franklin D. Roosevelt, World War II/Great Depression. It is his second or third or something cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, who is U.S. President. This goes a step further. Claims the United States has the right to intervene in the internal affair of any country in the Western Hemisphere. So this does not mean that if England sends a naval expedition to try to take over part of, say, Western Brazil, that the United States will stop it from happening. Argues that the United States has the right with anything that happens in Cuba, in Guatemala, in Nicaragua, in Brazil. If the United States is not happy with what's happening there, we Americans have the right to do something about it. Want to point out that this is a statement and not a treaty, not an agreement, and certainly no country in Central America, South America, was terribly happy with it. But again, might can make right, and the United States by 1900 was absolutely the power, the bully often seemed. And you'll see the United States, you can take a few minutes just to look at this. The United States certainly took good advantage of this. American military occupation throughout these areas during this period. Again, another reason perhaps the United States didn't need a formal empire. Well, Latin America really was part of the American domain. And then quickly, just one little engineering feat. We've already talked about the Suez Canal. Well, you see over here in the Americas. Problem, you want to go from San Francisco to Europe? Got to go the way around South America. Closely, you've got this area. This is actually modern day, or Colombia at this point, up until this point. This is solid land in the country that is today called. Looking even more closely, Colombia extended all the way, the Republic of Colombia, after liberation from the Spanish in 1821. This was all Colombian material. Ideas came from a French company, a British company, an American company. Let's build a canal here. Let's carve through the land so the ships will be able to go directly through the Americas and directly to Europe, much like the Suez, as I mentioned. Problem, if this is Colombian territory, who has to give the permission? And the answer is the country of Colombia. Nuh-uh. I don't know if those are the exact words they used. Not interested. U.S. tried to negotiate the treaty. It did not happen. So kind of tricky on behalf of Theodore Roosevelt and the Americans. They supported the independence of Panamanian rebels. And by that I mean sending in warships off the coast, providing arms, providing other encouragement, so that when they won their battle and declared an independent Panama, the United States can now negotiate directly with the Panamanian rebels that they had created and funded and helped win. And not too surprisingly, the new government of Panama says, come on in, United States. And the Panama Canal is built between 1904 and 1914. I just think that's such a great picture. I mean, you just think, oh, Panama Canal, a canal, you take some shovels, you dig. This is just a massive, if you think back to the early days of the Industrial Revolution, 100 years earlier, you have handheld looms that get, moved by a little bit of steam power, and look where we are not much more than 100 years later. Water being held back on both sides, pretty remarkable. Finish with a couple of cartoons. Theodore Roosevelt, one of his famous quotes, "I speak softly and carry a big stick." In other words, Panama, the Colombians don't want to do what I want them to. I'm not going to talk a lot. And if you take a look here, I ask you always with political cartoons, think of the prom date question. Would you or your sister or whoever wants to date a gentleman for the prom rather go to the prom with this man or this man? And I think most of you would say the handsome, strong, clean, virile U.S. President Roosevelt, and not the disgusting, slimy, big-nosed, stinky-looking, ugly, hideous little Colombian. By the way, most not look anything like that, as I'm sure you know. That's the purpose of the cartoon. And you see the United States cheering in the background. And Theodore Roosevelt, Congress debated, I went and took the canal. We'll leave you with this final quote from a retired U.S. General Smedley Butler. Questions for the class to discuss. We'll talk more about this. This is a retired general who had spent many years in the military forces and in Latin America. Again, it's about justice, about equality, about democracy. Smedley Butler, a retired U.S. general. By the way, my next child will be named Smedley. It's an awesome name. Maybe even Smedley Butler Zeger. Well, let me talk to my wife about that. So looking back upon his career from retirement, he has a, I think, fairly realistic view of what he was actually doing. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active service as a member of our country's most agile military force, the Marine Corps. I served in all commissioned ranks, from a second lieutenant to a major general. And during the period, I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism. Thus, I helped to make Mexico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank to collect revenues in. I helped to purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1909 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for American fruit companies in 1903. As a final question, stop the film and you are done. What is Smedley Butler saying about his role, about American role in Latin America? See you in class.